Good morning. We're on to part 2 of the Judge Not section of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. Now, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with what measure you measure, it will be measured back to you. So that's where we started yesterday. And we kind of need to recap this as we move forward. But again, one of the big keys here is that it's krino. It's a word that again it's translated destruction or damnation elsewhere. Um, it's the idea of casting a judgment, making a decree of the final destination, um, and then we're warned to remember with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. So God's judgment is not subjective. God's judgment is not subjective to, well, how we're judging. So once again, it's some of this hyperbole and some of the whole theme and vibe, you may say, of the Sermon on the Mount. If you just are very non-judgmental, it doesn't mean you're going to stand before God and he's going to just be very non-judgmental with you. Everyone will be judged by God's righteous judgment. Now, when it comes to the matters of the Bema seat, the judgment seat, the place where reward will be given or taken away, and again, reward, not salvation, well, there may be, factors taken into play. And Jesus talks about, in Luke chapter 12, how, hey, if people have more knowledge and more information, to much is given, much is expected. And so we see in James 3 again that teachers shall receive a stricter judgment. So we're not talking about salvation there. We're talking about reward, and that, yeah, people who should know more, and in many ways, that's those same people who are on track to receive greater reward, they'll be held to this high standard. Now, part of what we're seeing here, what's going on, is this idea, and I think the warning Jesus is giving is the idea of judging someone very coldly and harshly to the letter of the law. And we see that a lot. And it can be tough where people judge someone and maybe they just dismiss them as being an unbeliever because, well, they're failing at this point of the law and they're failing miserably. Therefore, they must be a unbeliever or just a really carnal babe in Christ. And sometimes when you see people with no fruit living in sin, well, yeah, I mean, that's not an illogical conclusion. Yet at the same time, if we were to pick a different point of the law and then have ourselves be judged by it, if we were to be judged by our generosity, or we were to be judged by our disposition, are you an angry person? Are you a lustful person? Well, I wouldn't want to be judged by that, but then, but it's okay if I judge someone else according to this one thing. I mean, it's really easy for me to judge someone and go, man, look at that. They struggle with substance abuse. They cave in and they go and they buy weed and they smoke it. They go and when they can't handle life, they go pick up a fifth of their favorite drink and they drown their sorrows. Those people are obviously pathetic Christians. And yet, if God picks another point of the law and checks my heart for pride and looks at my giving, my generosity, am I a gossip? Am I a slanderer? Wow, look at them. They gossip all the time. Well, they're just as bad as the drunk then, I guess. That's the idea now we have of this. With what measure you measure, it'll be measured back unto you. With what judgment you judge, you will be judged. Well, what kind of judgment? Well, it's this idea of a kind of a cold and heartless and graceless judgment. I'm going to judge you according to the law, according to this one point here, that obviously you're failing at. And so it says then in verse 3, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite. And there's our key word. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, do note, it doesn't say you're never allowed to remove a speck from your brother's eye. It says you should remove the plank from your own eye first. Hypocrisy is the big deal that has to be dealt with. Now, I will say this. It's one thing to just, yank a sliver out of someone. It's another thing when you've just had the painful experience of removing a sliver from yourself, or a large sliver, a big fragment, a shrapnel of wood stuck in your arm, so that when you see someone else suffering, and they're suffering because there's something foreign stuck in them that shouldn't be there and really does need to be removed. But when you've gone through the painful experience of getting it out of your own life, you'll probably be more fit to be the person to remove it from theirs. And there's where we get into some of the keys of this. You see this merciless judgment we talked about in the first few verses. That's not what you would expect from someone who has been experiencing the pain and the real what takes place to remove this sin from our bodies. And so when you go then to correct someone else, you'll find yourself a whole lot more tender, caring, thoughtful. It's the hypocrites who are struggling from self-righteousness. They're the ones who just try and, rebuke someone and tell them, oh, get rid of that sin and don't worry about it. And then, well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they probably haven't actually removed all that sin from their own lives. And when you look at Paul the Apostle, when you read the Paul of Romans 7, and oh, wretched man that I am, right? He knows, he understood his sinfulness. He understood his sinful condition. And I'm just going to go on a limb and say, if you're listening to this right now, in all practical sense, you're not as righteous as Paul was when he wrote the book of Romans. It sounds silly to have to say, right? But I mean, it's true, I think, that Paul the Apostle, when he wrote the book of Romans, was probably more spiritual than you and me, and probably more holy, more sanctified, and yet his mindset, because of a true realization of his sinful state, Paul said, oh, wretched man that I am. Why is it that I do the things that I hate and the things that I know I ought to do? I'm not doing those things. Well, it's the same Paul who then wrote Romans 8, right after Romans 7, a chapter full of comforts and assurances and promises. And you see, that heart, that Romans 8 heart that we all need to have, it comes from a right understanding of the Romans 7. You see, when I've been seeking the Lord about the splinters and the fragments and the beams that are still stuck in me, and I come humbly before God, trying to have God purify me and make me holy, well, then I'm a little bit less harsh and heavy when I'm trying to help someone else who's struggling. And so this is where Jesus is going with the judge not, that you be not judged. It's just that idea is that if you're going to have a heavy and heartless judgment of others, is that the way you want God to judge you? Or if you are, as a dying man, preaching unto dying men, well, that's a different story. When you realize, your right place in the cosmos as a humble nothing, trying to tell other nothings about the God of everything. That's the idea, is we need to be able to have this understanding of our own sinful state before we are able to properly, clearly see how to remove the specks from our brother's eyes. And quite often the people who are the quickest to boast out, the rebukes and the thises and the that's, they're often ones who aren't listening very well, or aren't spending really any time at all seeking the Lord about where they are at, where their hearts are at. And we begin to realize that this sin is no different from that sin, and they're all the ones that separate me from God. Now, there are sins the Bible talks about being more significant and things like that, but the main point is that you're still a sinner preaching to sinners. You're still a broken person trying to heal other broken people. And so, don't be a hypocrite. Really spend time with God, seeking out your own faults, your own shortcomings. Go through the painful experience of removing them. If you're having a hard time finding one, God will happily set a trial to your life. That's often what it is, a test or a trial. And even last Sunday, we talked a bit about this, that, things are all good. Well, until I'm asked to sacrifice, until I'm asked to remove stuff that I like, well, then it's work. So, all that said, don't be a hypocrite. Seek the Lord and treat others with the same tenderness you would hope he would treat you with. We'll move on another verse tomorrow. Until then, God bless you guys. I will see you guys around then.